Well, Attorney General, thank you so much for being here. It is a great honor and privilege to have you. I was very excited to have this discussion with you, and I know a lot of the attendees are interested to hear your perspectives on the topic, justice and the rule of law. But maybe just to kick it off, why are you here today? We're just excited to have you.
I'm so happy to be here for this occasion. We spoke earlier, and a couple of things. First, when I got the invitation to come speak at this, I had never heard of this group. And I thought, what is this? What is this? And then I started reading the principles. And one by one, I said, this is me. I believe in this. Every single one. And so that made it easy for me to come here. The other thing, sometimes qualms about coming to D.C. is when I come back here, I generally have very mixed emotions based on my experience here. It was a privilege of my life to work at the White House. The hardest thing I've ever done was be Attorney General of the United States. It's an incredibly hard job. And so I've had mixed emotions every time I've come back. But on this trip, I haven't had those emotions. I've been so eager to come speak, perhaps to break bread with allies. I think people who think like me about the rule of law, the importance of the rule of law, the importance of America's place here in the world. And so I'm just delighted to be here. So let's get off with some questions.
Well, that's fantastic. I think I want to start with your time as Attorney General, obviously. Obviously, the Department of Justice, the DOJ, is the source of a lot of scrutiny nowadays. What was it like leading the Department of Justice? What were the surprises that you faced, and what were the biggest takeaways after having served?
Let me begin by saying there should be scrutiny on the Department of Justice. It is a powerful institution. It can take away people's life and liberty. So the scrutiny is something that should always be there. There were a few surprises, relatively speaking, because I had worked for 4 years as White House counsel and had dealt with, if not daily, certainly weekly, with John Ashcroft, the Attorney General, and other senior leadership members at the Department of Justice. So I knew the players well, I knew the issues well, and so it was a fairly easy transition. But when I got over there, I also realized that less than 1% are political appointees. I had worked with even less than that. The rest of the individuals that work at the Department of Justice are career employees. They have little interest, or probably care a lot less than I certainly do, about who the Attorney General is or who the President is. They go to work every day, day in and day out, to simply do their job, to serve the American people. In the White House, I had a pretty small family of 14 lawyers in the White House counsel's office. The President's senior staff is fairly small. It feels like a family working in that building, which is relatively small. The Department of Justice is much, much different. And so one of the things that I discovered is I just knew so few people. So it was very, very different. And you had to rely upon the other Senate-confirmed appointees in order to make sure the work of the department gets done. As Attorney General, I would meet every morning with the senior team to find out what they were working on. I would travel a lot around the country, visiting U.S. attorneys' offices and raising the flag and thanking them for their service. I traveled to over 30 countries, again, to embassies. We had people stationed there, again, to thank them for their service. I had to do a lot of media interviews. I had to go to the Hill quite a bit to testify on various matters. And so the work of the Attorney General is very, very different than the work of those who go in and day out, simply doing their job for the American people. And I think it's important for the media and for critics of the Department of Justice to understand how difficult it is to politicize the work of the department. It is extremely difficult and dangerous for the Attorney General and for the President, because if you try to do that, it's going to become public, and you don't want that to happen, because it just damages the reputation of the Department of Justice and the President, and it affects the rule of law in a negative way.
It's a lot of good themes that you've raised there. I think, the theme of this conference is conserving America's liberal tradition. What do you see the DOJ's role in that process? How does the DOJ conserve that tradition, and what's the role of federal prosecutors in that system in our justice system?
I believe the Department of Justice is the guardian of our democracy, the guardian of our liberty. It's a very, very important department and very different from other federal agencies. The Attorney General is different from every other cabinet official in that the Attorney General wears two hats. On the one hand, the Attorney General is there to implement, to police the President's law enforcement priorities. The President campaigns to the American people, makes certain promises about law enforcement policy. It's the job of the Attorney General to make sure those policies are carried out. The Attorney General, however, unlike other cabinet officials, wears a second hat, and that is as chief investigator and prosecutor. There, the Attorney General is completely, or should be completely, different, completely isolated and not a part of what's going on in the White House, completely apart from the President's agenda. There, the Attorney General, the Department of Justice, has to be entirely impartial, following the evidence, making judgments about whether or not a prosecution is appropriate, and if so, to move forward in order to bring justice to the American people. So there is quite a difference in terms of the work of the Attorney General and the work of other cabinet officials, and it's very important for the Attorney General to always be very sensitive and keep in mind, all right, what hat am I wearing when I make this decision as in my position as the Attorney General of the United States?
I think those two hats, I think those it's hard to understand that, I guess, as for people who aren't lawyers or aren't familiar with the inner workings of the Department of Justice. And I think the DOJ's degree of independence or lack thereof sometimes from the executive branch, that's become a point of intense national debate. How independent should it be? Should it be carrying out the executive's priorities? What is the proper role and principled function of the department? And how do we reconcile, the need for federal prosecutors to check the executive branch for corruption or criminality while also carrying out executive branch priorities?
We live in a society that is governed by rules. And if those rules are not followed or enforced, then we have chaos. And we can't have a position, particularly in leadership positions, where people believe the rules do not apply, that they can break the rules without consequence. It's the job of the Department of Justice to make sure that those rules are followed. Now, obviously, the work of the department is not perfect because the work is conducted by human beings. Also, sometimes the department makes a mistake because discretion is afforded to investigators and prosecutors, and then at the end of a prosecution, the courts have a role, and they tell us whether or not the department has made the right judgment. And I think it's very, very important to accept the fact that the department doesn't have the final word. The final word lays with the courts, and this is why separation of powers is so valuable, because there is a check on the Department of Justice. When President Bush, during the first term after 9/11, he made some very significant decisions about how we're going to fight the war on terror. Decisions relating to Guantanamo, Geneva Conventions, interrogations, things of that nature. They were controversial and they were very, very tough. They were litigated, going up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Within the executive branch, I would gather all the lawyers from the various agencies that might have some kind of input in a decision, and we would hash it out in terms of what is the right legal decision, what is the scope of the President's authority. And at the end of the discussion, I would turn to John Ashcroft or his representative from the Department of Justice and say, you've now heard the decisions, you've now heard the discussions, but you are charged by statute to give legal advice to represent the United States government in litigation. And so you have the final word. And that's how we would make decisions during the Bush administration. But there were 4 times where the U.S. Supreme Court said those recommendations were wrong. They ruled against the Bush administration. And, it's a little bit humbling to go into the Oval Office and tell the President of the United States, Mr. President, the advice that the lawyers gave you about the scope of your authority in fighting the war on terror, we were wrong. And President Bush, to his credit, accepted those decisions and simply said, that's what the courts are for. They're there to tell us whether or not we are doing the right thing. And if they agree with us, great. If they say we're not doing the right thing, then we change course and do something different. And that's the way that I think all of us as citizens should feel about the role of the courts vis-a-vis the role of the executive branch. We each have a role to play. We have to respect those roles because they provide the certainty, the continuity of this great country of ours. And so that's how I would respond to your question.
The word justice, it's the Department of Justice. I'm curious to hear from you, in your perspective, what are some of the biggest injustices in America right now, and how do you think we can address them? As you know, from your time in the DOJ, what are the biggest ones out there that we don't seem to be getting quite right?
When talking about injustice in America, I try to begin with a view about how are we as a nation, how is our system of justice, how does it compare with other countries like Russia? Just had a very interesting discussion about Russia. I don't think their justice exists in Russia, certainly not to the extent it exists here in this country. And so I would say that we should feel fairly comfortable with our system of justice and the way that it works. But there is one area that I do have some concerns about. It stems from the fact that during my time as general counsel for Texas Governor Bush and then as White House counsel for President Bush, I made recommendations to Governor Bush and President Bush to clemency recommendations with respect to almost 50 state and federal death penalty cases as to whether or not clemency should be granted. And I'm of the mind that, and people obviously have very strong views about the death penalty, but I'm of the mind that the death penalty is an appropriate punishment in certain limited circumstances, not as a deterrent, because I don't believe it is a deterrent. I just believe that for society, at least for me, there are some crimes that are so heinous, so deserving of the death penalty, that I think it is an appropriate punishment. Say, for vicious crimes against a woman, for example, or vicious crimes against a child, torture and death of a child. I think in those instances, the death penalty, assuming you're following due process and rules in our courts, that the death penalty is important. However, during my time in government, I have observed that very few wealthy white individuals receive the death penalty and are executed. What I've often found was that the person, the target, was often a minority, black, Hispanic, Asian, certainly poor. Therefore, they didn't have the advantages that someone with more wealth had growing up and perhaps learning values and getting a good education, and certainly couldn't afford a good lawyer. And so I worry about the application of the death penalty to a certain small segment of our society that, quite frankly, perhaps that is something we ought to be looking at.
Switching gears just a little bit, the DOJ, the line prosecutors, they've become obviously a favorite target of certain politicians and disinformation.
Really?
Yeah. How do we? I mean, and it's becoming a problem really for our justice system and our courts. How do we combat that?
Well, it starts at the top, meaning the president needs to speak out against it. The attorney general needs to defend his team. I remember during one particularly difficult time during my tenure, one U.S. attorney took me aside, and this was someone who had been in the department a long time. He was senior, a little bit older than I was at the time, and he said, "You need to understand, General, that the Department of Justice is a castle, and the Attorney General is the moat around that castle. The job of the Attorney General is to defend the Department of Justice and defend the people that work in the Department of Justice. Not to condone any wrongdoing or mistakes they make, because surely that happens from time to time, but as a general matter, to be out there publicly saying, I support the men and women that work at the Department of Justice. We follow the rules. We ensure that rules are followed in our society." And so, I'd like to see more of that, quite frankly. I know it can appear defensive for the Attorney General or even the President to be out there talking about it, and you want to sort of minimize talking publicly generally about a controversial case. Nonetheless, that's one place where I start. The other ideas that would have would be situations or venues like this one, where hopefully you're getting an education about how the Department of Justice really works, how the people that work there are motivated to serve you. That's what they're there for. They're there to serve you. And we need to recognize that. Not to say that the department is perfect. Obviously, the courts tell us when the department is imperfect. And the Congress from time to time will also tell us publicly in the media and also publicly in oversight hearings. But it's very, very important for the American public to understand that the Department of Justice is there to defend the rule of law and your way of life. We need it to be as strong as possible. We need to care about that Department of Justice.
You know, you in one of your hats that you wear now as Dean of Belmont University, you spend a lot of time with, future generations of leaders and thinkers and doers. I'm curious if you think, have they been dissuaded from a career in the law, particularly the Department of Justice? Are you worried about sort of the crisis of confidence and the disinformation about all of this that's out there, that people are not going to be inspired to a career in the law and public service in that way?
Sure. Of course, I worry about it, but if they listen to me, and if you listen to what I said to them, I talk about how you go in, nothing could be as rewarding as the jobs that I've had as a lawyer, to be White House counsel and to be the Attorney General of the United States. It just doesn't get any better than that. It's why I went to law school, so I could make a difference in the lives of other people. And so that has been extremely fulfilling. I was in private practice for 13 years and really thought when Bush offered me the job to be his general counsel that I would do it for a few years and then go back into private practice to my nice, very comfortable life in Houston. But I quickly realized there was nothing like being in public service to really make a difference in the lives of others. And so you're right. When I speak to others, students, prospective law students, I talk about the fact that we are preparing you to be the next generation of leaders. Lawyers, despite all the lawyer jokes, when people get into trouble, who do they call? They call a lawyer. We are there. We are champions for others in need. We are a force for good. I've seen lawyers sitting by battlefield commanders in Iraq telling those commanders, this is a lawful target. I've seen lawyers on Capitol Hill at midnight negotiating on controversial legislation or an authorization to use military force. Lawyers are a force for good.
Yeah. We have a few minutes left, but you talk about lawyers and you talk about the way that they influence the rule of law in places like foreign battlefields. I mean, we carry as Americans, we carry this rule of law ethos with us, even to places where it might not even really apply. It arguably doesn't apply, right? And we take it there. And I'm just curious if, why do you think that is? I mean, what do you think Americans are so, why our country is so attached to the rule of law? Like, what has been its successes for us?
I think it just stems from the birth of this country. The Constitution of the United States. And it is, it is the essence of the rule of law. And you're right. I think it applies everywhere, even during the toughest times during the war against terrorism. We tried to always draw the box for the president in terms of, okay, Mr. President, all these activities within the box are lawful. All the activities outside the box, we would recommend that you not go outside the box. And he never would. He was always very respectful of that. I think it is important, again, to have rules, because if you don't have rules, you have chaos, you don't have accountability, and that's just not who we are as a society. That is not what America is. Today, too many people forget how special America is. She is so different. You travel around the world, there is no other country like America. I know sometimes we get discouraged about things going on here. I get discouraged and frustrated about what I see going on or not going on in Congress. No question about that. But we are still the greatest country on the face of the earth, and it's not even close, with all due respect to people that may not be from America in this audience. But we have to, as Ben Franklin said, a republic if you can keep it. We all have an obligation to work to keep it strong. Gatherings like this one is a great step towards doing that, and I salute you for coming here today.
And I get, and I guess one final thought here. Obviously this year it's an election year. It's an important one. The country's attention always focuses on the big questions, who we are. We've got a big decision to make, and I'm just curious. Stepping back from the law for a second, just our country, the health of our country, the discussions that we have as a society, has that changed? Are you optimistic? I mean, what would you, if you could say one thing to the country right now, what would you have us focus on as we look at this important year?
I'm an optimist by nature. Listen, I've seen the evil that man is capable of, but I've also seen the good. Brother helping brother, lifting people out of the rubble in New York City after 9/11. We are a strong, good, loving people. How many sons and daughters died on D-Day, not to preserve our own freedoms, but the freedoms of someone else, other countries, and lands far, far away? There is no other country that's given more sons and daughters, as I said, to preserve freedom around the world than the United States of America. We should be proud of that. We should maintain that mentality. People around the world are looking to the United States still today for hope in terms of what is possible. That is one of the reasons we have such a border crisis, quite frankly, is because what wouldn't I do to give my children a better life? What wouldn't I do? And so obviously I believe in lawful migration, and so we've got to get control of our borders. But people are coming here because the United States of America is still the greatest country on the face of the earth.
And one of the things that I think makes us so great is our Constitution. And you talked about the importance of our Constitution and the centrality of it. But a lot of people, I think, are questioning core pieces of it, whether it should be, controlling. What would you say to those people who are doubting our Constitution? They're looking to other places, Hungary, Russia, other places. What would you say to those people?
You're nuts. I would say, go live there and tell me after a year whether or not it's a better place. If you're unhappy with the Constitution, change it. Change the Constitution. If you're unhappy with it, if you're unhappy with the court decision that is supposedly a constitutional interpretation, all right, then, running around saying we need to fix the court, we need to put term limits, we need to, expand the court from 9 to 20, whatever. Change the Constitution. It's hard, and it should be hard. And maybe that's something that we ought to change, making it easier to change. But it seems to me that if you're unhappy with the Constitution, change the Constitution or get involved in politics or get involved in groups like this one, and start a dialogue about, how we can make America better.
We've got 90 seconds left. I don't know if you have any parting thoughts for the group. It's been a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Well, as I said, this has been a great experience for me. I'm hopeful. I am hopeful about our country. It makes no sense to run around with your hair on fire, because if your hair is on fire, eventually you're going to burn yourself and die, and you're no good to anyone. So it's okay to kind of run around and be concerned. We do need to speak out, because I'm concerned about how the election is going to turn out, quite frankly, and I think that that's going to present some real challenges. And so paying attention to what's going on is certainly important. And all of us we have a voice in the way that we vote. And I suspect there are people here from various communities, hopefully various states, and take this message, things that you're learning today, take them out to the community and start a dialogue, start a conversation about what the threats are, but also a hopeful message about what is still possible in the United States of America.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a fantastic.